Setting up for our recording for YouTube as well. Good morning, superfan, Mr. Bespoke. I hope that all is well in your world today. I'm also aware that since I have limited comments to people I follow and people that follow me, that we're not getting as many people to come into the broadcast, but that's okay. We do have viewers as well who are picking up the broadcast through our YouTube. So I am not concerned about numbers so much as I am concerned about quality of people and those who actually want to learn. So I'll just give just another minute. Got a little bit of a need to clear my throat this morning. Our weather in the eastern area has been going back and forth between cold and fairly cool. So we're trying to stay on top of it and keep our health together. All right, so we are back in Powernomics. We'll be back in Powernomics every Friday as long as we need to be. And we're also in Tools of Titans. Tools of Titans. I've been saying Tools for Titans, but it's actually, Tools of Titans. The tactics, routines, and habits of billionaires, icons, and world-class performers. And so we are in these two today, and we're in these two every Friday. And we're going to start back off with Powernomics with Dr. Claude Anderson. He is a leading voice in understanding economics in general, but he's also a leading voice in helping Black America to understand what it is they need to do to build wealth. And so he starts out by talking about this system of monopoly and how America is run by several different kinds of monopolies. And so today we're going to look at a brief history of monopoly building in America, and we're not going to get through it all, but what we do get through, it will be a substantial piece today. And then we're going to talk about productivity tips. If you are a business owner, what are some productivity tips that you can glean from and learn from today? So here we go. A brief history of monopoly building in America. Over the course of this nation's history, there have been at least three major phases of monopoly building for wealth and power. The first monopoly building phase in American history occurred during the colonization of America, when Europeans in general and the English in particular formed and held natural monopolies in land ownership, slave trading, and slave-supported industries. England exerted the power of its newly found slavery-based wealth by instituting what they call the Navigation Act of the 1760s and other laws and tariffs that mandated that American colonists ship their slave-produced raw products and goods to England for processing, manufacturing, and marketing. The colonists then had to purchase back the finished products at higher and inflated prices, right? So they would start out by collecting these raw goods from America. They would ship them to England. England would produce the final good or the finished good, and then they would sell it back to the colonists. So that went on, we know, for quite a bit of time. This system effectively allowed England to exercise full economic and political control and to economically exploit its colonies as well as other nations. England became a king of slave trading and held a natural monopoly on constructing slave-based economies. The English crown established the first franchising system in the shape of building plantations, in the shape of building colonies, right? And they financed the slaveholders, they supplied the slaves, and they shipped and processed the slave-produced goods. It took a full century for the American colonists to recognize they were locked into an English monopoly. Once the reality set in, they began calling those monopolies tyranny. Isn't that interesting? The American colonies rejected England's plans to expropriate the fruits of slave labor and to control the politics of the colonies. The colonists knew from English history of serfdom that any system that politically subordinates, economically exploits, and socially dominates a group of people is tyrannical because it reduces them to slaves. The colonists did not want to be England's serfs anymore. They preferred to fight, and when they did, they ignited and fought the Revolutionary War for their independence. The second phase of monopoly building began shortly after the Revolutionary War. The American colonists immediately drafted the United States Constitution, which, this is the irony here, imposed on black people the same government-sponsored tyranny that the colonists rejected under the English rule. So here you are, you're bucking against tyranny, and then you go and do and practice what you just yourself realized was not a sustainable model, right? That ultimately people are going to revolt and rebel against being suppressed, okay? The founding fathers of this nation, most of whom were slaveholders and sympathetic to other slaveholders, drafted and ratified the United States Constitution. That document gave the colonial slaveholders a collusive monopoly, the same monopolistic controls that England had over the colonists before the war. Just as slave labor had made England wealthy, it allowed Southern slaveholders to operate in their own best interest rather than the best interest of Northern whites or enslaved blacks. The North eventually concluded that it could not acquire competitive wealth and political power until it broke the South's monopoly on free black labor. In 1861, the Civil War broke out between the North and the South over wealth and political power. The third phase of monopoly building occurred after the North won the Civil War. The war effectively destroyed legalized slavery and transferred the South's monopoly on wealth and political power to the North. The North focused its newly acquired wealth and power on industrializing to the North and to the West. The massive amounts of money previously invested in the slavery industry and Civil War military production was then used to build bridges, canals, railroads, ships, and factories. However, in achieving the political and economic defeat of the South, the North had ignored the 5 million ex-slaves. So then it became an issue of, well, what do we do with all these people who were once capital, who were once a commodity, right? Because they were not initially seen as people. They were seen as property. And that seems to be the part that is lost on present day Americans. A group of people who started out as property, now you have to figure out what to do with them, because ultimately you never made place for them in the economy to be a competitor. You only made place for them in the economy to be a consumable good. I know that's harsh, but that's what happened, okay? So, major political organizations in the North went on record opposing emancipation of enslaved blacks unless, get this, unless they were shipped out of the country. Now do you understand why people keep saying, go back to where you came from? In order that they not compete against white men's labor. So they were saying, yes, we don't mind you freeing these products and goods, but they need to be shipped out of the country. Now here's the problem with that mindset. First problem is you have created a commodity, because these were not the original people that you brought over here. These are the people that you bred after the fact of bringing the originals over here. So these are not the same people that you would be able to ship back, and they would be able to go back to their country, and they would know their language, and their countries would receive them. See, that's what you call delusional thinking. Yeah, we created something, we purposefully bred slaves, but now we don't have a real need for them anymore, so let's just ship them out of the country. No, America, this is not how this works. All right? The North abandoned black ex-slaves. The South got the message and commandeered blacks into a somewhat semi-slavery, while the North looked the other way. All right? And unfortunately, our country is still not acknowledging what actually happened to our ancestors and how that is still yet affecting the quality of life that black people in this country as a whole live today. I'm not talking about the talented 10th. I'm not talking about the black elites. I'm not talking about the 1%. I'm talking about the majority of black Americans in this country, and their struggle to live a quality life stems from this piece right here. And until America comes to grips with itself and actually deals with what happens and makes an actual economic recompense, they're going to continue to see and continue to feel like black people are the problem. That's just the reality. All right? So he says here, according to a memorandum of proceedings in the United States Senate, this is on record, the southern states, by their situation and climate, require black labor and must have it, or the states will cease to have any value. So where did this value go? Where did this black labor value go? Because they were making money. They took the value off of the people and they put it in land, because at this point land didn't have the value that it has now. It was the people that had the value. So they took the value off the people and they put the value on land. Remember, before this time, they were giving away thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land to people. But it wasn't the land that was valuable. The land was not the value at the time. It was how many slaves you had on the land, working the land, that was the value. So because they could no longer value the slaves, they took the value off the slaves, put it on the land, and they put it in stocks, the monies that had been acquired. Okay? So what happens? You have about 5 million ex-slaves that the South doesn't have a plan for. They don't have a viable plan for. So what happens? The southern states began to enact what's called the Black Codes, that again gave them a shared monopoly control on land, economic systems, governments, education systems, and black labor for another 100 years. And now they're doing it again through the prison system. It's the same thing. Both the North and the South use various levels of government to create white-only business and political, intellectual, and social monopolies. These advantages of property, technology, political participation, and major business opportunities were passed on to their succeeding generations of white males. Remember, the original Constitution was set up to really address and benefit white land-owning males. All right? So, what do? When they realize that they've got to do something with this population, they began to enact codes that would put this population behind bars, out of the way of what? Competing against white men's labor. That's what it was about. They wanted them out of the way of labor competition. Because if I don't see you as a human being, I only see you as a commodity, I've got to find some way to turn you back into a commodity, even though I have said you are free. So after they realized that the North wanted nothing to do with the fact that they had released all these people, they said, well, we have to figure out some way to what? Make a dollar off of them. Okay? So they enacted the black codes, which allowed them to criminalize normal behavior of human beings. And if you were black and you were caught doing certain normal behaviors of human beings, you know, things like walking on the street instead of the sidewalk, just very minor stuff, they began to criminalize it to have a reason to put you behind bars so that you could no longer compete in the labor market. Okay? And then you began to be, again, according to the 13th Amendment, you began to be someone that they could re-enslave behind bars to help them build America, right? Because that's how America got built. It got built by the chain gangs. It got built by peonage. Okay, that's the official name that it was called, peonage. So you can look that up. All right. So again, the question becomes, when in this country have black Americans been actually completely free? And most people will tell you, if they're honest, most people will tell you that freedom for the black American is actually about 50 years young. So you're talking about, this is maybe the first or the second generation of black Americans in this country that have actually lived a free life, free to prosper, free to own businesses, free to start businesses, free to really get into the stock market, right? So let's backtrack that, and now you can understand why it's kind of ludicrous and ridiculous to ask a black American, why don't you have what a white American in this country has? You have about a, 350-year head start that your tyrannical ancestors gave you. You got about a 350-year head start on wealth building, while my ancestors' hands were tied, or they were working a field, or they were brought under peonage. Everything to kind of, it's almost like somebody putting everybody at the starting line in a race and letting your ancestor run around the track 350 times and then says, okay, now you can start, and expecting you to win the race. That's what America has done. And to criticize those who are trying to start businesses and to criticize their process and their progress and where they are is actually a little on the ludicrous side. When you actually understand the monopolies that was started in this country and how this country built its wealth. All right. So the first monopoly we're going to talk about, I believe, is, and we'll stop here in this book today, racial monopolies in America. So we've got racial monopolies, we have population monopolies, wealth monopolies that we're going to cover on Friday, and we'll get into media, political, and judicial monopolies and the implications of these monopolies. But let's look at racial monopolies in America. Racial monopolies predetermine winners and losers and are considered a normal part of our political economic structure. Through these monopolies, white society maintains a lock on the essential elements of black people's lives and make black people spectators in the democratic process. The racial monopolies discussed below are but a few of the nearly invisible structures that marginalize and justify black America's position as this nation's permanent minority loser. So that's what Claude Anderson says, is all of this is designed to make you a permanent underclass. So he's trying to help people to understand how these systems came to be, but also he's going to dig into the plans to get you out of this type of system. All right. Monopolies established in the Constitution. For some reason, we think that our Constitution is the most perfect document in the world. And some of us don't realize that our Constitution was not, again, something that just came out of thin air, but it was men studying other documents that they came together and began to piece what they were reading, and papers and economics and suppositions, that they came to the conclusion of the Constitution. Remember, these men were meeting for several days at a time trying to form this document. So it didn't just happen overnight. Okay? As indicated earlier, the United States Constitution is not and has never been color blind. The United States Constitution is race specific and color conscious. For all intents and purposes, the Constitution remains unchanged. The Founding Fathers were the first ones to play the race card. In fact, they were the original card dealers. They allocated rights, they allocated resources, and they allocated power through the Constitution to the majority white society. America essentially has two constitutions. I'm going to take a sip on that, because there's a lot of people that don't know that. And I challenge some people on that. And when I tell them, they recognize that I'm right. America has two constitutions. Okay? And then once you understand that, you'll understand a few other things about this country. They have a constitution for white people and a constitution for black people. Constitutional amendments 1 through 12 are race specific and empower the majority white society. The 13th through the 15th amendments were also color specific. These amendments gave citizenship and empowerment rights to black ex-slaves. The 13th Amendment eliminated so-called legal slavery, except, in the case of imprisonment. So if you become a prisoner or you become a convict, you get looped back into legal slavery through the 13th Amendment. And I do want to point out to people, in that amendment, if you go back and read it, it does not say, well, if you're a convict who has completed your time, you're no longer a slave. It says if you've ever been a convict, you are now looped into that slavery clause. And that's what some people don't get yet. That means if you've ever gone to jail and been convicted of a crime, they can use that clause to bring you into enslavement. The 14th Amendment gave blacks equal protection and due process rights under the law. It says you have the right to be equally protected as a citizen in this country. The 15th Amendment extended voting and other social rights to blacks. So the Constitution for the blacks is 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Majority society has now even co-opted these amendments with terms like minority. During Reconstruction in the 1860s, major social and economic forces began to make these amendments color blind, even though they were originally specific to black people. The term colorblind was not formally used until 1896, when Chief Justice John M. Harlan of the Supreme Court issued a dissenting opinion in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson decision. The Supreme Court upheld that there was nothing wrong with separate but equal accommodations for blacks and whites as a public policy. But Justice Harlan said that the Constitution was colorblind. He was the first to say it, but he was wrong. The Constitution is and always has been color specific.